Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Schreiner, leader of the Ontario Green Party and the MPP for Guelph. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today. I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from my home in Guelph on the traditional lands of the Adirondack, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And just want to reaffirm the Ontario Green Party's commitment to the truth and reconciliation process, and just express my gratitude from all I've learned from Indigenous peoples about how to be a good steward of the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and the people who call this place home. Many of you may know today is World Wildlife Day, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Norris, an ecologist and university research chair in the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of Guelph, about the ecology of the Greenbelt and what we risk losing if the government's plan to allow development on the Greenbelt goes ahead. Ryan, I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining me today. And I understand that you're joining us from a cabin in Algonquin Provincial Park, where you're currently doing field work. And so I thought before we started talking about the Greenbelt, can you tell us a little bit about what takes you to Algonquin Park in the middle of winter? And also more generally, a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm in Algonquin conducting long-term research on Canada jays, which is a species of bird that is in the boreal forest and is a year-round resident of the boreal forest. And I'm part of a study that has been going on for 55 years in Algonquin Park. Wow. I've been involved since about 2008, and one remarkable thing that Canada jays do, out of several, is that they start breeding now in the late winter. So we're out, myself and my students and field assistants are out looking for nests now on snowshoes, 6 foot deep snow every day. So it's lots of fun. It's fun field work. It's a rare long-term study. I'm involved with the other long-term studies too, and I'm interested in what influences wild populations, wild animal populations. I mainly work on birds, but I also work on butterflies as well, salamanders, and I'm interested in the factors that are causing declines in wild populations, wild animal populations.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate your research, and I know that the Biodiversity Institute, in particular at the University of Guelph, is just a jewel that I've loved spending time there, and just appreciate the good work you and your colleagues do. I want to just turn to the Greenbelt if we could, and the number that we often hear is that the 2 million protected acres of the Greenbelt provide habitat for 78 of the more than 20 provincially listed species at risk. And I'll just list them in generally as, you know, they include 25 plants, 25 birds, 12 reptiles, 5 mammals, 2 butterflies, 2 amphibians, and a dragonfly. And Ryan, I'm wondering if you could unpack what these numbers actually mean and talk about what we as Ontarians stand to lose if we lose these plants and animals.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not going to go through and unpack all the species, but it's certainly a long list.
Sure, we don't have that much time.
Yeah, we don't have that much time. So I would say, like, if we just take a step back, look at the Greenbelt, like from an ecological perspective, it encompasses what many people have probably heard of, the Oak Ridges moraine. That's one component of it. And that's a geological formation, glacier formation, that has produced kind of rolling hills and stuff like that from about Peterborough all the way to Caledon. So that's running north of Toronto. That's the north part of the Greenbelt there. And then the other big component of the Greenbelt, of course, is the Niagara Escarpment. So those two things combined really comprise the Greenbelt. Ecologically, though, the Greenbelt's in a type of forest called Carolinian forest, which is deciduous type of forest, high diversity of trees and plants, And its northern extent runs into southern Ontario, not much really any further than the Greenbelt. And that's a big reason why we have such a high diversity high diversity in southern Ontario compared to the rest of Canada. There's no Carolinian forest anywhere else in Canada. So we're blessed in southern Ontario with pretty high diversity of plants and animals and insects. And so that's why there's such a long list. If we overlap the species at risk that have either been listed provincially or federally, that's why there's such a long list in the Greenbelt, really. So I don't know if that answers your question. But I think another part of your question was, what do we stand to lose? Well, the Greenbelt is a big chunk of, it's not a park. It's something a little bit different. It's very unique, and it encompasses a lot of green space and some conserved area. And it is really, if you look at a map, it's a big hug around Toronto, right? It encompasses Toronto. And if you look at it from a larger landscape perspective too, in southern Ontario, it's quite significant. It is a significant area that I believe we need to protect over the long term, and for a number of reasons. Not just simply diversity, but we need to protect the plants and animals within the Greenbelt. They're part of quite a unique ecosystem to Canada, and they provide unique ecosystem services, or critical ecosystem services for not just people in the GTA, but people in southern Ontario too. So that's a little bit of unpacking, I suppose.
Yeah, and I've seen numbers suggesting that if you put, I guess, a dollar figure on those ecosystem services, $3.2 billion a year in ecosystem services the Greenbelt provides us. And one of the issues that I don't think enough people possibly understand is the issue around connectivity. And so when you start carving out chunks of the Greenbelt, and maybe create a Swiss cheese type situation, which is what the Ford government is proposing with their 15 parcels of land being removed from the Greenbelt. How does that affect species, biodiversity, habitat?
Oh, okay, yeah, and that's I think that's a really good point, because species, in order to have viable populations of species, you need not to just have area, but you need to, in some ways, preserve their ability to move between those areas. And if you isolate populations by having isolated habitat, you're in danger of those populations not being able to be rescued by other populations. You're in danger of changing their genetics because they're small populations. So what we want to do when we're designing a system of protected areas, we want to design it in such a way that they're somewhat connected to each other to allow that movement. And that movement's just not animals either. That's plants. That's dispersal by plants as well. So a healthy protected system is a connected system. And the federal government, has taken steps recently to recognize this at the federal level, at the protected parks level. So it's just as important at the level of the Greenbelt as well. And so if we continue to fragment that habitat, we're really messing with its integrity.
Right, and I guess in addition to the scheme to build homes on the Greenbelt, which, by the way, just for everyone watching, there's been numerous studies, including the one that just was released last week, showing that we have plenty of land already within existing urban boundaries to build 2 million homes, let alone the 1.5 million homes that's the provincial goal, without opening the Greenbelt for development. But in addition to the government scheme around building houses on the Greenbelt. They also proposed two highways, Highway 413 in the Bradford Bypass, what some people call the Holland Marsh Highway, that will intersect the Greenbelt as well. And we actually just recently learned that even after spending, almost $40 million studying the environmental impacts of Highway 413 in particular, the government hasn't even done any studies of how it would impact local endangered species, nor greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm just curious, as we think about connectivity, what's the effect of having building highways like these two 400 series highways that would intersect and pave over parts of the Greenbelt? How is that going to affect wildlife and species at risk?
Well, we actually did a quick survey of how many species the development of the 413 would impact. We didn't charge $40 million, by the way. It was cost maybe a couple thousand. And we came up with the number of 29 federally listed species that it would impact. It will cross 132 streams and rivers. So the list of 29 species, some of them are endangered, listed as endangered, some of them are special concern, which is, different levels of concern, I guess, in terms of their impact. The endangered species, of course, are the ones that we're particularly concerned about, and what Highway 413 would do specifically to impact them. So where do they occur outside of Highway 413? How would Highway 413 impact the populations that are in the way of the highway? So I'm happy to talk about those species, but I think the 413 brushes up against the Greenbelt, goes through the Greenbelt in some areas. If you look at the map of where the 413 is going, it's going through places like Nashville Conservation Reserve, right through it.
Right.
It's running through populations of endangered species like red-side dace, which is a fish that only occurs in a few streams in southern Ontario, listed as endangered. A dragonfly called the Rapids clubtail that occurs in 4 streams in Canada, 2 of which will be impacted by the 413 development, and the list goes on. The list goes on. So there's that immediate impact, and I'm talking about the immediate impact of the development, the habitat loss, and then of course there's whatever comes with the development of the highway, which inevitably will be industrial development, commercial development as well, I would assume. And we're just, we're getting too close to the Greenbelt, in my opinion. There, we're in the Greenbelt, and we're very close to the Greenbelt, depending on what section of the highway is being built. So I think it's an extremely dangerous proposition to make from an ecological point of view. And I think it's slightly different than what we're talking about with housing development. And, we can talk about some of the differences there if you want. But certainly, I personally hope that the highway doesn't get developed.
Yeah, because I'm assuming that it would affect things like migration pathways, and then roadkill on highways. We see that all the time, or just even things like road salt going into the waterways. I'm assuming all of that affects species in addition to the actual loss of habitat.
Yeah, for sure. There's those kind of I would call road mortality, as definitely a direct effect. Now, the degree of road mortality on a big highway, on a 400 series highway, actually probably isn't as severe as 1-lane, 2-lane highways in
Gotcha.
Rural 2-lane highways. Because there's already there's barriers that are put up that prevent a lot of species from crossing there. but certainly road salt,
Gotcha.
for sure. And one thing that a lot of people don't think of is noise. The
Right.
noisescape changes when you obviously when you put up a 400 series highway like that, and that matters for a lot of species. Certainly, we counted about 130 migratory birds that would regularly use the proposed 413 area, and those fall under
Wow.
the Migratory Bird Act. So not all of them are listed as threatened or endangered, but all of them fall under the Migratory Bird Act. So there's a lot that needs to be dealt with on that end as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I was hoping to shift gears just a little bit and just say, like, I grew up on a farm, and I know oftentimes when we think about wildlife, we tend to think of wild places, forests, wetlands, woodlots, and other undisturbed areas, conservation areas, etc. But the government's plan to open the Greenbelt for development also significantly affects the farmland that feeds us. And in particular, I think of the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve and the 4,000 acres of prime farmland that would be lost there. But one of the things I know from a lot of the farmers I've worked with throughout my career, that like they care a lot about wildlife and care a lot about the land they farm and trying to minimize impact. And I know you can't completely eliminate all impact, but I know a number of farmers, particularly those in the Greenbelt, take steps to minimize impact on species. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what role farmland plays in preserving biodiversity on the Greenbelt.
Yeah, and yeah, there's a lot to unpack there too, and I think I have several points for that. I think it's a good question. I think traditionally those two, conservation and agriculture, have seemed kind of as opposing forces. But I think more recently we've come to realize that there can be quite a bit of synergy there. There's been some really good research coming out lately about the value of agricultural areas, particularly marginal areas that can be restored to help, for example, pollination. And that can have quite a large effect on biodiversity. And a lot of farmers are engaging with this and restoring marginal areas, say, that don't make them any money. And that can have a big effect on creating corridors, for example, between different larger habitat patches. And so I'm quite optimistic. Like I think that there's a lot of positive coming out of that in the role of agriculture and conservation. There's also some species, even threatened species of special concern, that use agricultural habitat directly. Now there's a bunch of issues associated with that, but they've historically been open nesting species of birds that use agricultural habitats that depend on those habitats. So when those habitats are lost, we not only lose our ability to produce food, but we're directly impacting species too. And another point I think that is not often brought up is there's typically forested woodlots around agricultural areas. And what is not really considered much is, well, I'll say this. Most people consider a forested woodlot, but it's not really the case. It depends what it's surrounded by. And if a forested woodlot is surrounded by development, that's or housing development or industrial development, that's a lot different than a forested woodlot being surrounded by an agricultural field. And the reason I say that is because development brings in a whole suite of things. First of all, it brings in a lot of people going through forested areas. It brings in their pets. It brings in invasive species. So arguably, a forested woodlot is much better off being surrounded by agricultural field than a housing development. And a lot of the species that disappear from woodlots that are surrounded by housing developments are actually neophobic. And what I mean by that is you put up structures around otherwise natural habitat, and that's something different. And some species will just say, "I'm out of here. I'm gone," because my home's surrounded by this weird thing, and I don't know what it is, and so I'm taken off. And so you often see those habitats have much lower diversity. The last point is that farmers often manage their woodlots in a way that can be quite beneficial. That is, they might selectively log areas,
Right.
and that creates gaps and diversity in the forest structure. When a woodlot is surrounded by development, it's mostly left and left to grow. The understory disappears. People trample through it. So it can look a lot different. So all of those things, I think, speak to the value of having agricultural overdevelopment for species conservation. Now, I mean, I won't sugarcoat it either. There's some big, there's some potentially big effects of agriculture too, negative effects of agriculture on species too, depending on whether pesticides are used and how whether those pesticides get in to other natural systems and what their effects are. So, there's both sides. There's two sides to the argument.
Sure. And actually, hopefully it gives me an opportunity to plug one of my favorite programs out there, the Alternative Land Use Services, or ALICE program, which pays farmers for environmental goods and services, and something that I know private foundations are supporting right now in Ontario. But you've had governments like PEIs actually put provincial dollars into such programs, something I've been advocating for in Ontario to reward farmers for those good ecological practices that I know many farmers do engage in and want to engage in. And your arguments just hopefully enhance my advocacy for ALICE.
Well, I'll say
scientifically,
ALICE ALICE gets a big check mark. Ecologically, like the people are doing scientific studies in parallel with ALICE, and it's working. It's working, and it's a great program.
Oh, good. Okay, so you just validated my advocacy. Thank you for that. Right. I wanted to ask you. So I think it's pretty clear to folks, and I think you can see this in like the protests that are happening in communities all across the province, the big rallies that have been happening at Queen's Park, that people are really upset about the government scheme to open the Greenbelt for development, and people clearly see the negative implications of building housing on wetlands, farmland, the green space that cleans our drinking water, protects us from flooding, provides species habitat, etc. But I'm just wondering if you could comment on maybe the broader environmental implications of these Greenbelt, opening the Greenbelt for development to just sort of broader environmental impact just within like the region that the Greenbelt sits.
Well, there's a lot, of course. I mean, we have quite a jewel in the Greenbelt, I think, a natural jewel, and it provides all sorts of ecosystem services that are essential. And you can't trade ecosystem services. You can't get them from somewhere else. They have to come from where you are. And whether it's clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, soil erosion, all those things are happening in the Greenbelt, and we can't keep really compromising the diversity that happens in the Greenbelt, because the diversity is the thing that makes those services happen. It's like you have this big machine that none of us really understand, and you keep taking little parts out of it here and there, and the machine keeps working. Looks like it's still working, but eventually, you take the next part out, and then it just all falls apart. And that's what's kind of happening here. That's what's happening everywhere, really. And it's a hard thing to kind of forecast, right? Because you don't know which of the next parts is going to collapse the whole thing. That's what we try to work on, but it's a really, it's a really complicated problem. And really the thing that we can do is say that diversity matters. We know scientifically it matters. We've done hundreds and hundreds of studies that diversity matters for ecosystems, and we have to preserve that diversity. And so that's the case here in the Greenbelt. We need to work on preserving that diversity. We need to kind of listen to the science and to tell us what's a good thing to do, what's a bad thing to do. Of course, there's all sorts of other factors that play into decisions at that level, but science has to be one of them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think, we've probably learned more than ever in the last few years just how important evidence-based and science-based decision-making is. I don't want to ask you to be a politician here, so I'll save that for people like me. But I will say there have been calls for the federal government to intervene both on the highway issues, and I know they've agreed to do or looking into that with Highway 413, but also just in the Ford scheme to carve up the Greenbelt. And I think the basis of those arguments for federal intervention really rest on species at risk, which is your area of expertise. And so from a species at risk perspective, do you think that the federal government has an interest in stepping in under the Federal Endangered Species Act?
It seems like they have an interest. So under the Federal Endangered Species Act, really the federal government's main jurisdiction is Crown land, is land owned by the government, by the federal government. Okay, so that doesn't really encompass the Greenbelt. So that puts them in a bit of ties their hands a little bit. Now, the federal government can act on aquatic species outside of federal lands.
Right.
They can do a third thing, which I'm not even sure they've ever done. Or if they have, it's been very few times. And that is intervene in cases, basically like kind of an emergency stop order. There is a clause in the Endangered Species Act that allows them to do that. And that seems to be what the minister was suggesting maybe last month or so. So whether they would do that or not, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but they certainly at the federal land level don't have much of a case, obviously, with one exception, which is the Rouge National Park, which is out in eastern Toronto. And some of the proposed new development by the Ontario government is adjacent to Rouge National Park. Now, there they do have a stamp, but I think that jurisdiction for Rouge National Park, like on the basis of federal lands, only kind of extends to the immediate area, and the Greenbelt encompasses a much wider area than Rouge National Park. So I guess my answer is they can do something, and I'm hopeful they will, because I'm not sure that, that's one of very few options I think that we have to keep the Greenbelt intact.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And not to mention the people power. I keep telling everyone who are going to the rallies and the protests and everything else that's happening is don't underestimate how important your voice is. But I think at this point, we have to use every tool in the toolbox. So, you've generously given us a half hour of your time this afternoon and taken away prime afternoon research in Algonquin Park. And I want to just say how much I really, really appreciate that. And I'm just wondering, before we wrap up, if there are any other final thoughts, any other issues you think that we need to talk about that we haven't discussed. And I'll also reference, you wrote an op-ed as well on this issue, and people can probably use the Google machine to look that up. But is there anything else that you think we should discuss before we wrap up today?
I think I'll just echo kind of what you said, Mike, that I've been really impressed with kind of the public engagement on this. And if you're not engaged, please do get engaged. And it can make a big difference in this issue. And I think the government's, it'll put more pressure on the government, and that's a good thing. I've just been so impressed with how people have been engaging on this topic. So please keep going, and if you're not involved, please consider getting involved.
Well, hey, I appreciate that, Ryan, and thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for just giving us a little science, a little evidence, a little research and information on species at risk, especially on World Wildlife Day today. And keep up the good work, and good luck in Algonquin Park with your fellow researchers. And when you're back in Guelph at the university, I'd love to spend some time and with you and your students and your research associates.
Fantastic. No problem. Would love to have you. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks. And just want to say thank you to everyone who joined in today. This is an important conversation, and I think another perspective on just how reckless, dangerous, and destructive the government's schemes to open the Greenbelt for development are, especially as it relates to species at risk. And so I want to just thank you all for joining us today, and keep speaking out on this issue.